Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the second to last unit in the course. Remember that final papers are due May 9th. And last week we discussed radicalization and de-radicalization. So still kind of related to that, this week we're going to talk about correlates of failure of terrorist organizations. So this week we're going to look at some research articles focused on what types of things contribute to the demise of terrorist organizations. So there's 4 readings this week. Each one presents a little bit of a different perspective on the topic. So the first one I'm going to discuss is, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Gabalev and Sandler. They examined 586 different terrorist groups that existed between 1970 and 2007. Now, not all these groups persisted that whole time, but each group included in the study persisted during that time frame or during that time span. The average length of time that the group persisted was about 10 years. 26% of the groups did not last 1 year, and about 68% of them lasted 10 years or less. So the average duration of groups that survived more than 1 year was 13 years. So if you take out all the groups that didn't make it 1 year, just kind of the ones that were a year older, the average of those was about 13 years in length. And they looked at a wide variety of variables, and I know that article is a little bit hard to read because there's a lot of real kind of techie statistical stuff in there. But they looked at a bunch of different variables to try to determine what impacted a group's ability to exist in any particular year. They found that larger terrorist organizations were less likely to die. And that's a pretty common theme, not just in terrorist organizations, but organizations in general. They also found that religious fundamentalist groups are less likely to die than other types of groups. And then if a terrorist group had multiple home bases, they were also more likely to survive, which also makes sense, right? If you are located in more than one place, it's less likely that you'll have problems in all those different places. They also found terrorist groups that resided in the Middle East and North Africa were more likely to survive than those in other regions of the world. Being located in democracy enhances the chances of survival, as well as being located in a place with a higher percentage of jungle habitat, which was interesting. I've never seen that sort of thing looked at before in any of these articles. Obviously, jungle is difficult for anyone trying to combat the terrorist group to actually find them. It provides quite a bit of sanctuary for them. Then they also found that those that exist in landlocked countries were less likely to survive. They didn't have access to international waters. And finally, one of the things that was most interesting to me anyway was that if you looked at groups post-1997, that more transnational attacks hasten the group's demise. So these are all pretty interesting findings and certainly have some policy implications, and they do a pretty good job of discussing those policy implications in the last part of the article. Something else that was interesting is that they found that only 26% of first-year groups survived to year 2, and that's a much lower percentage than what a lot of people have found. Rappaport suggests as much as 90% of all terrorist groups do not make it to year 2. And in some of my own research, I found right around that number as well. But if groups do make it, again, you have the group size factor involved. If they do make it to year 2, it's going to be important to address them early before they are able to gain in size, because as they gain in size, they also gain in organizational capacity, and the more organizational capacity a group has, the more able they are to commit violence and commit acts or terrorist acts. All right, so the next article I'm going to talk about is Cronin, and this was one of the, it's not the earliest one, but it's one of the earlier works on causes of terrorist group demise, and it's kind of one of the seminal pieces. If you read Many of these articles, most everybody will cite this particular article by Cronin. And they've also written a book about this. This is just part of it. There's a ton of information in this article. It's really thick. If you printed it out, you can see it. And it's like 40-something pages long, I think. But Cronin takes more of a case study approach. Where the first article was a lot of statistical stuff, formulas, and all that. Very qualitative or quantitative. Cronin takes a much more qualitative approach, and so they highlight various factors that have been determined, anecdotally at least, looking at groups to cause the demise of terrorist groups. They report the killing of a leader, unsuccessfully transitioning to the next generation, achieving success or whatever cause they were working for, transitioning to some legitimate political process through negotiations. If they lose political support, popular support. If they lose popular support, if it could end through repression, governmental repression, or they transition out of terrorism into other forms of criminality and just simply become criminal gangs, or they go to a full insurgency. They're not just a terrorist group anymore. There's no way that I can discuss everything that's in that article, because there's a ton of stuff in there. But one of our interesting discussions is on the killing and capturing of a leader. And another article we have for this week by Johnston discusses that very thing, and only that thing. So the capturing or killing of a leader may lead the group to end, but it also could have the opposite effect and create a martyr out of the leader, that actually benefits the organization, lead to increased activity, increased recruitment. So she also suggests that arresting may be a better option, but again, only in some cases. So she then takes all this discussion and then applies it to Al-Qaeda. It's a really good article. It identifies some really key kind of characteristics of what people think contributes to terrorist group demise. The third article that I just referenced is by Johnston, and he focuses on whether or not removing a leader is an effective counterterrorism strategy. You hear all the time talking about targeting leaders. Who are the leaders? We need to get rid of the leaders. We need to catch the leaders. So-and-so killed whatever leader. It's a very, very popular strategy for governments who are combating terrorism. And, it makes sense, right? You think about if you take out the leader, then maybe, the rest of it will go away. If you cut the head off, maybe the body will die, kind of thing. So Johnston actually looked at 119 different attempts at removing leaders. About 40% of those were successful. So about, I don't know what that says, about 45 of those roughly were successful attempts where the leader was actually removed. And he found that the removal of the leader did increase the chances of the government's defeat. That's insurgency. It also reduced attacks and diminished overall levels of violence, but only in about 25 to 30% of the time. So it's not a surefire way, to end a group or a terrorist campaign. Also importantly, he found really no evidence of this martyrdom effect, that Cronin talked about and that others have talked about in their articles when he talk about, the killing or removing of a leader. He really found no evidence that the martyrdom effect has any impact on the group. So it really doesn't decrease the government's chances of stopping the insurgency if they due to the martyrdom. All right, so the final article this week is actually one that I've published that came out of my dissertation research that I did when I was at Michigan State getting my PhD. And I examined whether participation in violence by domestic far-right groups impacts groups' longevity. Now, the first three articles all focused on transnational terrorist organizations. My article focused on domestic far-right organizations. So I looked at whether participation in violence, then also whether violent and nonviolent groups were impacted differently by external and internal characteristics. I'm not going to list all of them. They're all in the article. But I had a whole variety of external and internal characteristics that I looked at in relation to violent versus nonviolent groups. And we didn't find a direct relationship between group participation in violence and a shortened lifespan, which kind of goes against, some of the stuff that Guybolev and Sandler found, where more transnational attacks hastens demise. But of course, we're not talking about transnational groups, right? We're talking about domestic far-right groups. But it was interesting because one of my hypotheses was that group participation in violence would be related to a shortened lifespan. We did find that violent groups were more likely to be influenced by external factors, such as interacting with the police and being located in a red state, which is a state that supported Republicans for president. But we also found that nonviolent groups were more likely to end because of internal characteristics, such as factional splitting. So it's really interesting because nonviolent groups were not impacted by external factors, and violent groups were not impacted by internal factors. So it suggests anyway that violent groups interact more readily with their environment and are more susceptible to environmental influences than are internal groups that are nonviolent groups, who are more susceptible to internal types of squabbles and internal problems. The other interesting finding was that there was no relationship between participation in violence and group longevity. And I even created a second variable of extreme violence, groups that participated in a lot of violence, and I didn't find any relationship there either. So it kind of begs the question, why don't all groups then participate in violence if there's really no impact on the group itself, as far as survival? But there's certainly issues with that. I discussed those in the article. That it's probably a much more complex kind of relationship than just simply, do they participate in violence or not. But anyway, that is the quick summary of the 4 readings for this week. Be sure you read the articles in their entirety. There's lots of good stuff in there. There's no way, that I could do it all in this video. Make sure you complete your discussion board for this week, and let me know if you have questions about this topic or about your papers or kind of anything going forward. I'll see you next week.